Hi friends. Okay, so production process, this is in our book at the end of chapter 1. So there's that whole section. There's a section we looked at when we talked about jobs in the theater at the beginning. Then there's a section about running a follow spot. And then the third section in the chapter is the stage management section. And this is where they discuss in a little bit more detail production process. And this is something we'll do an activity where we lay out an example production process on next Monday in class. So that's where we are in the book, kind of end of that page. I will show you. You see? Working as a stage manager section, and then we kind of get into process, right? How that goes from the stage manager's perspective. We'll talk about it in an overarching sense. Okay, so we have structures for theater production that we talked about already, right? So that includes your commercial theater, regional theater, academic theater, storefront theater, community theater. This production process is specific to the regional and academic theaters. Okay, so this is what we're working in right now. So this is the version of production process we'll talk about. Just as a reminder, here's how we think about production process, right? So we have a producer or a theater department. Then we have the stage management team and the production staff team. And then we have what's happening in the rehearsal room with the director of that specific play, with their specific design team, and with their cast and crew. So step 1 is pre-production, right? So this is everything that happens before we get into physical production on the show. The first element of pre-production is season selection, okay? So this is where our show is selected for production by the artistic director or a committee of the faculty, and then the specific artistic staff, right? So if you look back at that artistic team list, for this production are designated or hired, okay? So that's a director for the show. If it's a musical, it would have a music director, a choreographer, and then a design team. So that includes, so this process is usually made up by the artistic director, executive director, production manager, or a faculty committee, right? So those are the people who are involved typically in season selection. So then once we've selected our season, we'll hold auditions where we audition our actors for the productions that we have coming up. Often in an academic situation, they'll hold those auditions during the semester before, depending on the producing model, or they'll hold them at the very beginning of the semester of the production. So that would include your director, if you have a casting director. So in a professional situation, there's often a casting director who helps make those casting decisions and helps figure out who to call in. And then your stage manager will typically be there. So simultaneous with that audition process, you will have the beginning of design meetings with your design staff. So this is where the director leads an artistic conversation amongst the collaborators, and an initial design direction is established. So in this meeting, you'll have your director, your scenic, costume, lighting, sound, and video designers. Sometimes the stage manager or production manager will come, but for the most part, these are creative meetings, and so we're at the very early part of the process in establishing the look and feel of the show, and working with the director to help fine-tune their vision and figure out how we want to approach the show. So we don't need our technical staff, right, as much in this conversation. The first designs that will be due are typically your scenic and your costume designs. Those preliminary costume and scenic designs are presented to the shop for review, and then the shop responds with a bid, a cost estimate, and then the designs may need to be adjusted to stay in budget. So once the shops have bid the design, and then you go back and you reevaluate it with your director, make sure everything is going to be possible and feasible within the time and financial constraints, then the artistic team and the shops will sign off on a design plan that makes it final, and that will and that design plan, once finalized, will be a contract between the designer and the shop, okay? So this, you have your scenic, your costume designers, your director of the show, and then a technical director and a costume shop manager as representatives of the shops who are executing those products, and the production manager as like the head honcho of the land of the budget, okay? So this happens first prior to everything else because scenic and costume designs require a lot more lead time for execution. They have to be built or sourced or found. They're physical objects. And so you typically will finalize those early before rehearsal even starts, and often they'll be built as rehearsals are starting or before rehearsals are starting, depending on your producing model. When you're in a professional situation, you might have 4 or 5 weeks of rehearsal total for a professional production. 3 weeks is possible for a professional production. So the lead time for your scenic and costumes could be well ahead of the rehearsal process beginning. You do, however, need a cast. So auditions have to happen before you can generally finalize any sort of costume design, because in costume design, the body is primary. So if you don't have a body, how can you make clothing for this character, for this specific person? So you do have to have casting before you can finalize a costume design. So the next thing that's going to be happening is your scenic and costume shops will begin work. So they will pull rehearsal props and costume pieces so that they're ready for rehearsal. The stage managers will tape out the set design in the rehearsal space. So they will make a mock-up on the floor so that in rehearsal everyone knows what's going on. The shops will begin building the show, prioritizing elements that might directly affect rehearsal. So if you have a trick prop, they might build that first and get that into rehearsal as soon as possible, so that it's available to the director and the rest of the production staff and the rehearsal team. So this is your technical director, costume shop manager, production manager, and props master are beginning this work under the supervision of the design team. So as your show kind of starts going into rehearsal, you may have preliminary lighting, sound, and video system designs that can be prepared based on those scenic and costume designs, right? Again, we have our shops take a look at those initial preliminary design deadline products, and then they respond based on budget, feasibility, etc. Sometimes sound is prepared before rehearsal so that you have access to it to work with in the rehearsal process. So this is your director, once again, is involved in these preliminary designs, your lighting, sound, and video designers, master electrician, head audio engineer, and production manager. This stuff can overlap with the beginning of the rehearsal process because typically less lead time is needed on some of these elements. But anything that directly impacts another department is something that these teams will start on as early as possible. So if you have, for example, a set which has sconces on the walls, that's a lighting department issue, and so they would want to give feedback on that. Or in a Broadway situation, space is at a premium, and so you'll have negotiations between your scenic designer and your lighting designer and your sound designer about where in the physical box of that Broadway theater, which is much smaller than you think, all of those elements will fit. So then we head into production. And at this point, we go into a first rehearsal process. The first rehearsal is generally when your entire production team gathers. The director introduces the concept for the show. Designers present their designs and research. Actors are going to read the script for the first time. If this is a regional theater production, your designers may fly in for this first rehearsal and then leave again. Or they may send an assistant or a local deputy to present this material, but generally they will try and be there for this even if they're not in residence at the time of first rehearsal. So this is your full artistic staff and cast. Your production staff is typically invited. People from the administrative staff will come to these as well, just to get a better sense of what's going on the shows that they're marketing. So it's generally a big group meeting, full team meeting, where everyone gets together to read the script as a whole after seeing all of this presentation work. So then we go into a rehearsal process, which is 4 to 6 weeks. It can go longer in an academic situation where there's a limited amount of time available to rehearse, right? You guys have other responsibilities. This is also true in 99-seat theater, where we only rehearse about 4 hours a night, as opposed to regional theater, professional theater, where you would do an 8-hour rehearsal day, just like a regular job. So in this rehearsal process, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, your director and your cast analyze and work through the show. They stage the play scene by scene. The stage managers communicate anything that is discovered or changed from the rehearsal to the design team through daily rehearsal reports. And so typically in our rehearsals, we see the director, stage managers, and cast. Often designers are invited, but they are not necessarily present at every rehearsal. Simultaneous with this rehearsal process, you'll have costume fittings, and those are scheduled by the stage manager and the costume shop so that the performers and actors can be fitted and adjustments can be made based on what they need the costumes to do in the rehearsal process, and also just the tailoring to fit actors as we go. So this is your costume shop. Costume designers will be typically present at these fittings, and then the cast of the show is scheduled by the stage manager. Once the show has been fully staged, there will be a designer run typically, and that is scheduled generally, we hope, 2 or 3 weeks before we go into tech rehearsal. So this is a designated run through of the show from beginning to end in the rehearsal room, which is scheduled so that the design team can see the shape of the show, ask questions, and make adjustments to plans according to the progress of the staging, okay? So this is your entire creative team come to these designer run-throughs, and this is generally where your lighting designer is going to make final adjustments to their plot. So oftentimes things are discovered in the staging of the play that may not have been evident in the initial scenic drawings. And so once the play is staged, the lighting designer has a much better idea of what is going to happen, where the people are going to be on the stage for the various scenes. And so they can make fine-tune adjustments to their plot so that they can submit a final plot before the load-in of the show. They'll also be able to build cue sheets and other stuff like that. This is especially challenging with a new play because the script tends to keep changing. But this is generally around when you would start limiting the changes, depending on the show, depending on the producing team. So then we have load-in, okay? Load-in is when we move the scenic units into the theater space and assemble them on the stage itself. Typically, they are not built on the stage. They're built in another space, in a shop, sometimes not even on the same site. And so that load-in day is when we move in our scenery. We also have lighting, audio, and video equipment that is installed according to all of the plans that the designers have created. So this is all of your production team, department heads, crews, and frequently designers will come in for this load-in period to help support. And depending on the show, this can be orchestrated in different manners so that it might make sense. For example, it might make sense to hang all of the lighting equipment before the set comes in while you have a clear stage, so that you can use things like pneumatic lifts and drive around on a clear stage, and then put in the platforms after that so that you're not having to use ladders. Things like that tend to go on in load-in strategy sessions with a production manager. So once everything is loaded in, you have lighting and video focus time and audio quiet time are scheduled. And so this is when your lighting designer will come direct the focus of the instruments where they're pointed, make sure the colors are all correct, all of that stuff. Your video designers will aim and map projectors and prepare. And then your sound design team trails off. Your sound design team will also have a focus, typically, right, where they will come in and point speakers where they go, and then they'll have some period of quiet time where no other work is happening in the space so that they can set preliminary levels, get everything organized before tech so that they don't come in and like every sound cue is 10,000 decibels that blows everybody's ears off. They're able to get some of their stuff roughed in the physical space. So this includes lighting, sound, video designers and their crews. Okay, once all of this preparation is complete, we start tech rehearsal. And this is the intensive period where everyone comes together to build the show, and to pull together all of the performance that's happening in the rehearsal room with all of these technical elements that have been prepared. So there are some places where a dry tech still happens. So a dry tech is a rehearsal or a designated period of time with no actors. So it's dry because there's no actors, where the designers are able to compose their lighting, sound, and video cues. And then they also will communicate those cue numbers and placement to the stage manager via cue lists. So this is time before the actual rehearsal with actors begins to build those cue sequences for the show. Okay? And that includes your director, your stage manager, your designers, to varying degrees. So sometimes there's just not time for a dry tech. Sometimes they want to sit down and look at every single cue with the stage manager and director before any actor comes on stage. That second version, where you look at everything before anybody is on stage, happens a lot with opera, because opera singers we respect their instrument, and so we can't expect them to sing the show over and over again. So almost all of the cue composition in an opera project happens outside of the time with the performers. On stage, we stop and go and repeat. And that happens in a tech or a cue to cue. So the team then starts at the beginning, works through the show, stopping and starting to integrate each lighting, sound, and video cue, and this happens with the actors on stage. So in a tech, you might start at the beginning of the show, run the scene, stop each time you get to a cue. But you would run scene sections in between cues. In a cue to cue, you have less time available for the process, so you would, instead of just running through the scene and stopping at cues, your stage manager could lead you to skip from one cue to the next cue in order to make most efficient use of time. So this includes your creative team, your cast, your production staff. It tends to be at least a week. Frequently it'll go over a weekend in an academic situation so that you have time to do a long day, like a 10 out of 12 or an 8 out of 10, which is hours, 10 out of 12 hours worked, 8 out of 10 hours worked, so that can all happen in a condensed period of time. Then we have dress rehearsals. So a dress rehearsal is once you've added costumes into the process, and typically once you reach the dress rehearsal process, you run the rehearsal without stopping. Costumes frequently are added during the tech, but may not be fully integrated until a dress. It depends on the specific institution, how that language is going to play out. All right, so then once we've done dress rehearsals, we're at performances. And the first kind of performance is a preview performance, and this is when you have a performance for an audience before the show opens to press review, right? And so this allows the opportunity for an artistic team to adjust the production in response to the reaction of the audience, okay? So this is still all of your creative team and production staff are here. You'll also have administrative staff, box office and house management staff that are present for the preview process. So typically in a regional theater situation, your previews happen at night. Then the next day you'll have about 4 hours on stage to make adjustments in rehearsal, and then you take a dinner break and you come back and do another preview performance at night again. Often a script in a new play will be locked for the tech process, and then they'll unlock it in previews so that the writer can make adjustments or changes to scenes and transitions, and then the designers make their own layers of adjustments to adapt during those afternoon preview rehearsals, and then they go and do another preview with the audience at night. That's typically a week or two, depending on the show. If it's a Broadway show, if it's Spider-Man, you can be in previews for freaking ever until you finally get it right. Once the show is ready, Then you're doing performances, right? And that is the show opens, the director and the designers don't have to come anymore because it's done. And at this point, the stage manager maintains the production in the absence of the director. And that means that now your major design staff are going to leave and do their next show. Your stage manager, run crew, and cast, and box office and house manager and staff are going to continue running the show for whatever period of time is scheduled for the run of that show. And then once either an extension happens or doesn't, whatever, once it's run, whatever that scheduled period of time is, then you close the show and you do a loadout or a strike of the material that was part of the physical elements of the show. Once the show closes, all of the show-specific elements are removed from the theater space, which is restored to its original condition in a strike or a loadout. And any rental gear is returned, costumes and props are cleaned and restocked, and any useful scenic elements may be broken down and stored for future use. In a tour situation, this is when the entire production is loaded onto a truck and taken to the next stop on the tour. In a situation where you're hoping your regional theater show goes to Broadway, you would also load that whole production onto a truck and it would go into some sort of a storage facility until it might be produced again. And then this element of the equation is typically your production staff. Usually your design team is not a part of this process because it's happening well after the opening of the show, and all of those artistic team members have moved on and are doing their next show. In a case of like college theater, we all pitch in at strike and in loadout to help restore our spaces and prepare them for the next project that comes in. So that's production process. Thanks. Bye.